Everyone thought she was helping me. That was the story everyone liked. Every morning my son kissed my forehead before leaving for work and said, "Mom, you don't have to do anything today." And every morning, the moment his car disappeared down the street, I was handed a list. People saw kindness. I lived inside instructions. I am Margaret Collins, and for a long time, I believed love meant staying useful. I wasn't always living in their house, and I remind myself of that more often than I admit. I had my own small condo once, nothing fancy, but it was mine. Sunlight hit the kitchen counter just right around 9 in the morning, and I'd stand there with a mug of strong coffee, feeling steady. I raised my son Daniel in that space. I paid my bills, drove myself to appointments, chose my own groceries, and slept without feeling like I was in anyone's way. I wasn't lonely. I wasn't helpless. I was just older, and that had never scared me until it started being used as a reason. When Daniel married Rachel, people kept telling me how lucky I was. She smiled easily, spoke softly, and never missed a chance to say "Mom" in front of others. She posted pictures online about family dinners and gratitude, always tagging me with little hearts. When my knee gave out and surgery became unavoidable, Daniel suggested I move in with them for a while. "Just until you're back on your feet," he said. Temporary. Sensible. I agreed, because that's what mothers do when they don't want to be the reason their child worries. I told myself it was practical. I didn't realize it was also permanent in ways no one said out loud. At first, Rachel insisted I rest. She brought me soup, fluffed pillows, asked if I needed anything every time Daniel was within earshot. Friends commented on how caring she was. At church, someone squeezed my hand and said, "You're so blessed." Rachel laughed and said, "We take care of our own." I nodded along, because disagreeing would have sounded ungrateful. Behind closed doors, the tone shifted quietly, the way a room cools when the sun moves away. The soup got thinner. Not bad, just thinner. The pillows stopped being fluffed unless Daniel was home. Mornings changed shape. Daniel left for work at 6, tie straight, lunch packed, coffee travel mug in hand. Rachel waved from the doorway, all smiles. The second the door shut, her voice dropped into something efficient. Not angry. Not cruel. Just organized. "Margaret, the dishwasher needs unloading. And the laundry's been sitting." She didn't ask. She informed. I told myself she was busy. I told myself helping was normal. Helping made me feel useful, and useful felt like a reason to stay. Soon, helping became expectation. Breakfast dishes weren't mine, but they landed in my hands. Floors stayed dirty until I noticed them. Groceries were bought, but somehow I was always the one chopping, stirring, wiping. Rachel called it routine. She said routine was good for me, kept me active. When I mentioned my knee hurting, she tilted her head and said, "Movement helps." Doctor's orders, right? I couldn't remember a doctor saying that, but I let it slide. It wasn't worth the awkwardness of correcting her. Money grew quiet too. Daniel used to hand me cash for my prescriptions, joking that I spent less than he did on coffee. Now Rachel handled it. "I've got it covered," she'd say brightly. Some refills came late. Some didn't come at all. When I asked, she frowned like I'd misplaced something important. "I thought you already took it," she said once, tapping her phone. The doubt didn't land on her. It landed on me. Maybe I had forgotten. Maybe I was slipping. The idea scared me enough to stop asking. Daniel didn't see any of this. Or maybe he didn't want to. When I hinted that I was tired, he laughed gently. "Mom, you're tough. You always have been." He meant it as praise. Rachel stood beside him, nodding, her hand resting on his arm. In front of him, she asked me if I needed anything. I always said no. Saying yes felt risky. Saying no kept things smooth, and smooth felt like peace. The kids learned fast. Emma stopped saying thank you when I folded her clothes. Noah left his plate on the table and walked away. One afternoon he said, "Mom says this is your job now." He wasn't being mean. He was reporting the same way kids repeat rules. I smiled and cleared the table. Children don't invent disrespect. They inherit it. The house changed in small, deniable ways. A chair I liked disappeared into the garage. My shelf in the fridge shrank. My coffee was replaced with a cheaper brand. "Tastes the same," Rachel said with a shrug. It didn't, but I drank it anyway. Silence became my habit. Silence felt safer than questions. Silence felt like protection, even when it started to feel like shrinkage. Afternoons were the quietest. Rachel scrolled on her phone while I wiped counters that were already clean. Sometimes she filmed short videos in the living room, talking about family values and respect for elders. I stayed out of frame. She never asked me to join. She didn't need to. The image worked better without me in it. I told myself this phase would pass. I told myself Daniel worked hard and didn't need problems waiting at home. I told myself love meant endurance, and endurance meant staying quiet. What I didn't understand yet was how carefully everything was being arranged, how each small task trained me to accept less, how every public smile bought permission for something colder in private. By the time Daniel came home each evening, dinner was ready, the house looked decent, and Rachel looked exhausted. She leaned into him and said, "It was a long day." He kissed her cheek and thanked me for helping out. I said, "Of course." The word felt automatic, like muscle memory. That was how my days began to blur together. Morning kisses, closing doors, quiet lists, and the steady belief that if I just kept going, things would balance out again. I didn't know yet that balance was never part of the plan. I only knew that staying silent felt easier than admitting how small my world was becoming, one reasonable request at a time. Everyone still thought things were fine, and that belief settled over the house like a routine nobody questioned, like background noise you stop hearing after a while. I learned that my days had a rhythm that didn't belong to me anymore, a rhythm that pretended to be care, and once I noticed it, I couldn't unsee it. Morning started before sunrise because if breakfast wasn't ready when Rachel came downstairs, nothing was said out loud, but everything changed. She never raised her voice, never complained directly. She just moved slower around me, her steps deliberate, her eyes scanning the counter, the sink, the stove, as if checking whether I'd missed something obvious. That silence felt heavier than anger because I didn't know where to put it. Daniel would already be halfway out the door, tie crooked, coffee in hand, kissing my forehead and telling me to take it easy, and I'd watch his car disappear down the street knowing the house would exhale the moment he left. Rachel's tone shifted then, not cold, not cruel, just efficient. She'd say things like, "Let's be mindful today," or "We talked about this," phrases that sounded harmless, but landed like reminders that I was already behind. I told myself families adjust, that this was normal, that love meant being useful, and usefulness meant not complaining. Groceries were suddenly something I needed permission for, not directly, just through comments about rising prices or how the kids were growing and needed more. My bowl of soup was a little thinner each week, my slice of bread cut in half without explanation, and when I noticed, I blamed my appetite, not her choices, because it was easier to doubt myself than question the peace. Medication became something I had to ask for, and every request came with a sigh, a pause, a look at the clock, like I'd chosen an inconvenient moment to age. I started feeling grateful for basic things, which scared me more than the deprivation itself. The house was clean, the fridge stocked, the kids dressed well, and from the outside it all looked fine, better than fine, like one of those families people admire. Rachel played that role effortlessly, complimenting me in front of neighbors, saying she couldn't manage without me, touching my arm just enough to look affectionate. Later, alone, she'd remind me to stay out of certain cabinets or mention that I'd already had coffee, hadn't I? In that calm voice that made me feel childish for asking again. Daniel didn't see it, or maybe he didn't want to. When I tried to mention something small, something that felt off, he brushed it aside with a half smile and said I was overthinking it, that Rachel had a lot on her plate, that I was tough and always had been. He wasn't cruel, just tired, and I loved him enough to let that be the end of it. The kids learned quickly what worked. Emma rolled her eyes when I reminded her about her shoes. Noah ignored me unless Rachel repeated my words, and once Emma laughed and said, "Mom says this is your job now, not mean, just factual," like repeating something she'd heard often enough for it to feel true. At dinner I waited until everyone had finished before serving myself, a habit I don't remember choosing, and conversation flowed around me about school events, work stress, weekend plans, all things I listened to but wasn't invited into. Sometimes I caught my reflection in the dark microwave door, standing there with my hands folded, and I barely recognized the woman looking back. She looked smaller, quieter, like she'd learned to fold herself into the corners of other people's lives to avoid taking up space. I began writing things down, not because I planned to confront anyone, but because I needed proof for myself that I wasn't imagining it. Dates when money was moved, times medication was delayed, comments repeated often enough to form a pattern, like, be mindful, or we talked about this, always said gently, always leaving me feeling like I'd failed some unspoken test. The notebook stayed hidden inside an old planner nobody ever touched, and adding to it felt strangely grounding, like anchoring myself to reality. One afternoon, our neighbor Linda stopped by with cookies, smiling and asking how I was settling in, and for a moment the truth pressed against my chest, hot and urgent. I almost told her everything, almost let the mess spill out, but Rachel appeared beside me, arms sliding around my shoulder, saying I was doing great, that I loved being needed, and Linda nodded, satisfied, already turning back toward the door. That was the moment it hit me how easy it was for the story to stay neat as long as I stayed quiet, how silence didn't just protect the family image, it protected the system that kept me small. I wasn't angry yet. Not in a loud way, just tired in a way rest didn't fix, a deep fatigue that came from constantly adjusting myself to fit someone else's comfort. I started noticing everything then, the way Rachel stepped in whenever Daniel asked me a direct question, the way my name was used when something went wrong and skipped when things went right, the way gratitude was expected but never returned. I didn't change my behavior outwardly, didn't argue, didn't withdraw. I just watched and listened, letting moments play out without smoothing them over. Daniel still kissed my forehead. Rachel still smiled for the world. The house still ran on my quiet effort, but inside something had shifted. Silence wasn't keeping me safe anymore. It was just making me easier to overlook, and as I stood there each day, paying attention, collecting truth without reacting, I understood that seeing clearly was the first real choice I'd made for myself in a long time. Even if I didn't yet know where that clarity would lead. They still spoke about me like I wasn't there, and at the same time like I was permanently there, fixed into the house the way furniture is, useful, expected, rarely thanked. I noticed how people asked Rachel how she managed everything, how she smiled and said it was a team effort, and how that word never reached me unless someone else was listening. By then my days had become predictable in a way that felt less like routine and more like erasure, and I learned to measure time by small things, by how long my tea sat untouched because someone needed something first, by how often my name was called only when a task was incomplete. I didn't stop doing what I did, I just stopped offering explanations, and that change was quiet enough that no one commented on it. Rachel kept her tone smooth, still using those same phrases, be mindful, we talked about this, like they were guidelines written somewhere I'd failed to read, and I began to hear how often she repeated them to others too, to the kids, to Daniel, always gentle, always reasonable, always making it sound like order instead of control. Daniel stayed busy, his work stress growing, his patience thinning in ways that never quite reached anger, just absence, and when he came home tired he wanted peace, not details, so I gave him peace and kept the details to myself. The children followed whatever energy filled the room, and lately that energy wasn't mine. It belonged to schedules and rules I hadn't set, and when Noah forgot his lunch once and blamed me without thinking, Rachel corrected him lightly, but didn't look at me. And that felt worse than being blamed outright. I could feel myself shrinking in moments like that, choosing silence not because I thought it would fix things, but because it kept the day moving, and somewhere along the way I realized how much of my worth had become tied to not being an inconvenience. I paid closer attention then. Not in a suspicious way, just observant, the way you become when something important is slipping and you don't yet know how to catch it. I noticed receipts left on the counter that didn't match what was in the pantry, small amounts transferred from my account with explanations that sounded reasonable until you added them together, and I wrote them down the same way I'd started writing everything down. Calmly, without emotion, like a witness instead of a victim. There were moments when Rachel's mask slipped just enough for me to see the calculation underneath, like when she reminded me in front of Daniel to take my medication, her voice sweet, concerned, and I realized later the pills were missing from the organizer. And when I mentioned it quietly, she said I must have taken them already and forgotten, and Daniel nodded, already distracted by his phone, and the subject was over. I didn't argue, I just noted the date. Linda stopped me again one afternoon while I was getting the mail, asking if I was feeling better because she'd heard I'd been tired, and I almost laughed at how information traveled so smoothly without ever reaching me directly. She asked, gently, if everything was okay inside the house, and the question sat between us heavier than it should have, because it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't urgent, it was just human. I told her I was fine, because that was still the easiest answer, but walking back inside I understood something clearly for the first time, that my silence wasn't neutral, it was actively shaping the story everyone else believed. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat alone in the living room and looked around at a space I'd helped build and now barely occupied, and I felt a shift that didn't come with anger or tears, just resolve. The kind that settles deep and doesn't ask permission. I stopped filling in gaps after that, stopped reminding, stopped smoothing over mistakes that weren't mine, and the house responded almost immediately. Not with chaos, but with discomfort, like a machine missing a quiet but essential part. Rachel noticed first, not directly, just through tighter smiles and more frequent reminders, and when things went undone she corrected them herself with exaggerated patience, making sure Daniel saw how much she was handling. I watched it happen and felt strangely calm, because for once the effort wasn't invisible, it was just no longer mine. Daniel started asking questions then, small ones, about schedules, about why certain things were late, and Rachel answered smoothly, explaining how hard it was to manage everything, and I let her, because I knew the truth didn't need my voice to surface. It just needed space. The kids grew restless, testing boundaries that shifted without explanation, and Emma snapped at Rachel once, repeating one of those phrases back to her. We talked about this, and the room went quiet in a way that told me something important had cracked. I didn't smile, I didn't intervene, I just observed, understanding that patterns, once noticed, don't stay hidden forever. I felt no urge to confront anyone, no desire to defend myself, because defending implies accusation, and I was done accusing. What I felt instead was clarity, a steady understanding that my life didn't have to be loud to matter, that dignity could exist without permission, and as I sat there listening to the house adjust to my absence in ways it didn't know how to name yet, I knew this middle space, this waiting, wasn't weakness, it was preparation, and whatever came next would arrive on its own terms, the way truth always does when you finally stop carrying it alone. Everyone still thought I was the same woman, the quiet one who stayed in her lane, who smiled at church potlucks and nodded during family dinners while my plate stayed half full and my voice stayed unheard. And that misunderstanding became my cover without me ever planning it that way. Because by the time this fourth stretch of my life began unfolding, something inside me had already shifted, not loudly, not in a way anyone could point at and say that's when she changed, but in a way that felt like finally standing up straight after years of bending so the ceiling wouldn't crack. I started noticing how carefully Melissa managed her kindness when others were around, the way her hand would rest lightly on my shoulder when neighbors dropped by, her voice turning honey-sweet as she'd say things like, "Mom doesn't eat much these days, doctor's orders." While later that same night she'd stack leftovers into containers labeled with everyone's name except mine, sliding the fridge drawer closed like it was nothing, like I hadn't cooked half those meals back when my hands were steadier. Ethan stayed glued to his phone most evenings, tired from work, checked out, always saying he didn't want drama, and I understood that better than he knew because for years I had swallowed my own discomfort to keep his life smooth, to keep the house calm. But now I could see how that silence had trained everyone to see me as background noise. The kids picked it up without malice, repeating Melissa's tone when they spoke to me, casual, dismissive, calling me grandma like it was a role, not a person, and I'd smile and let it slide because old habits die hard, but inside I was filing things away. Dates, patterns, small contradictions that didn't add up. When Melissa said the bank account was tight yet ordered new furniture online without blinking, when she insisted my medication was too expensive but showed off a new purse at brunch, when she told Ethan I preferred staying home while casually leaving me out of weekend plans, I stopped correcting her, not because I agreed, but because I was done wasting breath on people who weren't listening. That was the phase outsiders never see, the strategic quiet, where you stop reacting and start observing. And it changes the energy in ways that make others uncomfortable without them knowing why. I began keeping my own records, nothing dramatic, just copies of statements, notes from pharmacy visits, dates of conversations, all tucked neatly into a folder that looked boring enough to be invisible, and there was power in that. A steadying calm that settled over me like I had finally taken my hands back from a tug-of-war no one else knew was happening. One afternoon, while waiting for a prescription refill, a woman around my age struck up a conversation, small talk at first, weather, aches, the usual, and then she laughed softly and said, "Funny how people decide what you need without asking." And something in her tone cracked open a truth I'd been circling for months, that my silence hadn't been noble anymore. It had been convenient for everyone else. I didn't go home angry that day, just clear, and clarity has a way of sharpening choices. I started saying no without explanation, declining errands that weren't mine, eating before dinner if I felt hungry, booking my own rides to appointments, small moves that shouldn't have mattered but did because Melissa noticed, her smiles tightening, her patience thinning in private even as she kept up appearances in public, and the contrast between those two versions of her began slipping through the cracks. Ethan caught glimpses he couldn't unsee, comments that didn't line up, expenses that didn't match explanations, the kids mentioning things casually that contradicted what he'd been told, and I didn't rush to connect the dots for him, because that wasn't my job anymore. The tension in the house thickened, not with shouting but with unease. Like, everyone sensed something was off, but couldn't name it, and in that quiet pressure I felt stronger than I had in years, grounded. Done apologizing for existing. By the time Ethan finally sat down across from me one evening, rubbing his face and asking, almost confused, "Mom, are you okay?" I looked at him and realized this was the moment my old self would have rushed to reassure him, to smooth things over, but instead I just met his eyes and said, calmly, "I am now," and let the weight of that answer hang there. Because sometimes the most powerful move isn't explaining yourself, it's allowing the truth to surface on its own, and as the house settled into an uneasy quiet that night, I knew the story wasn't turning yet, but it was lined up, ready, waiting for the final pieces to fall exactly where they belonged. Everyone thought the hardest part was already behind us once the tension finally came into the open, but the truth is an ending like mine never shows up with fireworks or slammed doors. It shows up the way real accountability usually does, quietly, with records, pauses, and the slow realization that silence was never ignorance, it was observation. By the time Ethan actually started looking instead of assuming, I had already shifted something inside myself. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't waiting to be understood. I was simply done shrinking to keep other people comfortable, and that clarity settled in me like a steady weight, grounding rather than heavy. Melissa didn't fall apart when things began to surface. She didn't cry or rage or beg. What she did instead was far more revealing. She grew sloppy. The careful timing she once kept slipped. The explanations she'd rehearsed no longer lined up. And that's usually how the truth steps into the light, not with drama, but with fatigue. It started with a bank notice that came addressed to me by mistake, one of those old joint accounts Ethan thought had been closed years ago. I'd kept an eye on it out of habit, nothing more. When Ethan noticed the withdrawals, small, spaced out, labeled as household adjustments, his expression changed in a way I hadn't seen since he was a teenager realizing he'd crossed a line he couldn't joke his way out of. I didn't rush to explain. I didn't tell my side first. I just reached into the drawer and handed him the folder I'd kept, thin enough to look harmless, heavy enough to tell a full story. Dates. Copies. Pharmacy printouts showing refills skipped or delayed. Grocery totals that dipped only when my name was on the list. Notes I'd written to myself, not accusations, just facts. He sat there going through it page by page, the room dead quiet except for the hum of the fridge. For the first time, he wasn't defending. He wasn't saying she didn't mean it that way. He wasn't brushing it off. Numbers don't care about intentions. They don't soften themselves to protect feelings. They just sit there and tell the truth. When he asked Melissa about it later that evening, she tried to keep her tone light, laughed a little, said it was all being taken out of context, just budgeting, nothing personal. But when Ethan asked why my medication was marked as optional while subscriptions, delivery orders, and impulse purchases never seemed to pause, something shifted. It was subtle, just a fraction too much silence before she answered, but it was enough. The kids were in the other room, and that mattered to me. I didn't want raised voices echoing into their memory. So I stayed seated, hands folded in my lap, and said calmly that I didn't want a scene. I meant it. I didn't want spectacle. I wanted understanding without trauma. That night didn't end with shouting or doors slamming. It ended with a silence so thick it forced everyone to sit with what they'd ignored for years. Sometimes that's the most uncomfortable consequence of all. In the weeks that followed, things corrected themselves the way they tend to when lies lose their footing. Accounts were reviewed. Responsibilities were clarified. Boundaries that had never been spoken out loud suddenly existed without needing to be announced. Melissa adjusted, not out of remorse, but out of awareness, and while that may sound cold, it was enough. Accountability doesn't always arrive wrapped in apology. Sometimes it shows up as changed behavior under watchful eyes. Ethan apologized once, quietly, one early morning while the coffee brewed. No long speech. No tears. Just a simple, I should have listened. I accepted it the same way it was offered, without turning it into a lecture, because regret that's real doesn't need to be punished to be understood. The kids shifted too. At first they were unsure, then gentler. They started asking instead of assuming. They called my name instead of waiting for me to respond automatically. I didn't hold their past behavior against them because they were repeating what they'd been taught, and breaking cycles means knowing where responsibility actually belongs. Neighbors noticed changes before anyone said anything out loud. Melissa's public warmth dulled. Her patience wore thinner when no one was watching. Little inconsistencies showed up in conversations. People didn't confront her. They rarely do, but they noticed, and noticing is often the first step toward truth spreading on its own. I reclaimed small things that turned out to matter more than anyone realized. Control over my finances. Control over my schedule. Control over my space. I stopped asking permission for things I'd already earned. None of it felt like revenge. It felt like balance returning to a place that had been leaning the wrong way for far too long. One afternoon, I sat on the porch with the sun warming my hands, and a neighbor stopped to chat, told me I looked strong for my age. I smiled, because strength isn't what people think it is. It isn't endless endurance. It isn't surviving quietly at your own expense. Strength is recognizing when patience has turned into self-erasure and choosing, calmly, to step back. If you believe elders deserve respect, not silence, please like and subscribe, because stories like this don't spread through shouting, they spread through recognition. I didn't leave the family. I didn't burn bridges. I didn't demand punishment. I simply stopped disappearing. And once that happened, everyone else had to adjust to the fact that I was still here, still present, still paying attention. They learned, slowly and a little awkwardly, that quiet doesn't mean weak, that patience isn't permission, and that love without respect eventually hollows itself out. There was no final confrontation, no dramatic justice scene, just a steady correction of truth settling into place. And in the end, that was enough. I didn't raise my voice to be heard. I raised my value, and once I did that, the world around me had no choice but to meet me where I stood.